Sooner or later, we have to consider complex life. I don't know when or whether we're going to discover planets with complex life on them, but when we do, then we need evolutionary biologists. And the reason that we need evolutionary biologists is that complex life doesn't evolve for the sake of complexity. Complex life only evolves because of the complex interactions between organisms, the complex ecosystem. You have one organism chasing after another to try and eat it, and this one's running away and it's eating some sort of plant. The plants are getting light, and they have to worry about parasites. It's these complex food webs and complex interactions that drive complexity in an ecosystem. And it's understanding that will be the most difficult thing, probably, for understanding life on another planet.
Hi, Eric.
Hi there. Hello.
It's such an interesting thing you work on. How did you originally get interested in this subject?
Wait, what subject?
Well, communication amongst animals, and then ultimately how it would affect other life forms, possibly on other planets.
Right.
Well, I mean, my day job is communication amongst animals on Earth. So that's what I do. And I work on, wolves and dolphins and parrots and gibbons and a few other things, and look at how they communicate, what they communicate, because there's always something, right? Animal communication is always saying something, otherwise it wouldn't have evolved. So there's a very close connection between that and asking, what are they saying? And that's not an easy question to answer. So there's a lot of kind of maths in this. There's a lot of analysis and algorithms, and can we figure out how much they're saying, if they're saying anything at all? And that just really lends itself really well to questions like, well, what about communication we don't know anything about? What about communication between beings that we've never come across before? Would we know that they're talking to each other or to us? Would we know how much they're saying? Have they got a language? Or is this just some sort of random sounds or random signals? So the connection is all there in the idea that we don't know what animals are saying. We want to know. And how do we go about that? How do we go about finding out what these communications really mean?
Well, how do we go about that?
Yeah, it's not easy. And I can't say that we've got really good answers for most species of animals on Earth. But the kind of things that we do is we look at how complex the communication is and try to make a link between that complexity and the amount of information that's in there. Now, that's not a simple connection, right? You can't just say, oh, well, the more complex it is, the more information there is. That's not true. It's a little bit more difficult than that, because actually really, really complex sounds probably have very little information in them. They're probably just random.
Can you give us an example of an?
Sure. Well, if you can imagine a bird singing, okay, so you have a bird that's singing an incredibly complex song because they really want to impress the female birds. They've got this male bird making a really complex song.
How do you know they want to impress the female bird?
That's not a dumb question.
Yeah.
And a lot of the time we assume that is the case because we've sort of inherited that idea from generations of scientists. But there are ways you can test. I mean, you can look and see whether, for instance, male birds that have a more complex song are more successful in raising chicks. And then that's the sort of the obvious way to do it. And that's been done with fewer species than we would have liked, but enough to give us an indication that that's probably got a lot to do with what's going on. So if you do have a male bird singing a really complex song, it could be that it's just the complexity itself that's impressing the female. It's not that there's more information in that song because it's so complex. It's like, doing some really, really complex riff on your saxophone or something like that. And that's impressive. But it's not to say there's more information there. So the link between complexity and information isn't quite that straightforward.
So do you see similarities between parrots and wolves and other animals? Is there a hierarchical structure to language, amongst mammals?
Yeah, we try and look for commonalities, of course, because if you can understand a common mechanism, then you're really onto something. There's at least a possibility that mechanism is something that's operating at an evolutionary level. So one example of that kind of mechanism would be what I was referring to before, that if you really want to convey a lot of information, You've got to use a signal that's complex, right? Because a simple signal doesn't have any information in it, but not too complex. It's got to have this sort of nice balance of complexity, reasonably complex, not too complex. And that is something that we see in a number of different communication systems. They just seem to be just right. They're just balanced between too simple and too complex. And you see that across different species. So we can hypothesize there may be a mechanism going on there, right? They may be optimizing this balance between complexity and simplicity. You do see that in a number of different species. Yeah.
What are we trying to learn when we're trying to understand the language of animals? Like, what is it? Do we bring it back to ourselves, like the narcissistic humans that we are? Is it always about us, or is it something to really about being observational?
Yeah, it's not always about us. It is nice if we can draw such broad conclusions that we can say things about the evolution of our language. I mean, we are unique. We do appear to be the only species on Earth that has a language, however you define that. But in any case, we're certainly the only species on Earth that really seems to be able to communicate a essentially unlimited number of concepts. How that happened, how that came to be, we have very little idea. And it's a pretty controversial question. The answers are much disputed. So it would be great if we could study animals and draw some conclusions about how human language evolved. That's not the end goal, though. That's not really the main goal, because it might not actually shed light on that. What we're really interested in is looking at why animals communicate the way they do. Well, what do they have to say? Why is it so important for them to say the things that they have to say? I mean, there are a few things that are clearly important, right? If you're a male, you want to say, come mate with me. I'm the person that's worth mating with. If you live in a group and there are predators around and you want to say, watch out, there's a predator. So there are some things that you can see why animals would have that ability. And then there are some animals that just exceed that ability by so much. Parrots and dolphins, and you just think, why? What is all this for? What is all this communication for? And that is a question that we really could do with answering.
The eye has evolved many times in different situations. You can look at it in the ocean, you can look at it on land, all these different things. Is language also a thing that evolves in the same kind of way?
Well, again, we are working on the basis that we're the only species at the moment that has language. Anything that you could really go anywhere close to calling language. All animals communicate in one way or another. We know that. We haven't found a single species that comes close to what we would call language. We know that dolphins have very complex communication. We know that they don't have a language. There's just not that much information that they're conveying. We know that there are some species that may or may not have ability to learn a certain amount of human language. Maybe some primates, some parrots can learn to converse in a meaningful way. Whether or not they use that in the wild, they probably don't. So we really don't think that language is anywhere else on Earth except for us and our immediate ancestors, of course. So the question of whether language has arisen multiple times is a problematic one, but could it arise multiple times? Yes. I think the answer to that is definitely yes. There could well be planets with multiple species of linguistic creatures, and it could have arisen separately. Yeah.
And before we go on to the other species, can I ask you a question about our relationship to a domesticated wolf, i.e. a dog? We're all trying to communicate with our dogs. At least I know Jessie is constantly.
Well, we think we're communicating, but we don't
think
really
we
know.
are.
We don't know
are,
what the
for
dog.
sure.
Well, we're communicating in some sense, but we don't really know what a dream. We don't know the dream of a dog. They could be dreaming anything. They're running.
No, we're imposing, right? We're imposing something, but I'm just curious about interspecies communication with, a domestic. Let's say the case of a dog. A dog will sit. What's happening there? What's going on there?
There's certainly communication. I mean, I wouldn't qualify that at all. There's certainly communication, just as there is communication, as I said, but all animals communicate. They must. And there's a fair amount of interspecies communication that goes on in the wild as well. It's not that rare. Clearly, what happens with our domestic animals, and particularly with dogs that have evolved with us, co-evolved with us for so long, been selected to understand the messages that we give. So they're actually genetically more disposed to understanding us and to us understanding them. But clearly, there's a lot more information that we can convey and convey reliably. A lot of that has got to do with training. So, you train your dog to sit, and the dog comes to understand what sit means. It's not born understanding what sit means. They're easier to train to sit on command than, let's say, a wolf, because that's part of their domestic makeup. But you can train most animals to do most things. Training is very powerful. The operant conditioning is a very powerful technique, and you can really train pretty much any animal to do pretty much anything that's within its physical capabilities. So I think there's two sides to it. I think there is genuine communication and there's a genuine understanding, and there's also that element of training. Now, there are species, of course, like grey parrots, the famous ones. Irene Pepperberg has been working with, where you really see this kind of linguistic ability that's clearly beyond what we understand from communication with our dogs. But that is a different phenomenon.
No, she found a parrot that understood. Not all parrots understand.
And I think the key thing here is what I mentioned before. They probably don't do this in the wild. It's probably not the case that you have these flocks of African grey parrots and they're all talking to each other and saying, give me, there are 3 green blocks or whatever.
Right. Sounds like a Disney movie. Yeah.
Yeah. But I think what she showed was that the brain of the parrot is capable of doing this. And that's an important thing as well.
So bird brain is a really positive.
No,
yeah, exactly.
No, groves of trees will collect together to fight parasites or to conserve water or do various things that are about their survivability. Now they're communicating through some sort of chemical exchange. How do you see that in terms of this discussion about language and consciousness in some sense?
Well, I said that all animals communicate, but that doesn't mean that the only thing that communicates are animals. All animals communicate because they have a very important property, which is that they need to solve problems. Animals need to solve problems all the time. They move around. This is the essential characteristic, really, of the animal lineage, is that they have to find food. Plants just sit there and soak up their energy, but animals need to go out and find it. So they have a lot of problems to overcome, and they have to communicate with each other. If plants have an urgent problem to overcome, then evolution could favor a form of communication between plants. That's true. Would it evolve into language? No. In the same way that a worm will not evolve language, it just doesn't have the evolutionary need to that sort of complexity, that level of complexity of information that needs to be conveyed.
So in some sense, do you think that it's the problem that defines the amount of communication that's required over time?
I think that's an absolutely perfect way of putting it. Creatures, organisms do not evolve abilities just because it would be fun for them to have that ability. It has to give them a concrete advantage. Otherwise, there's no evolutionary pressure for it. And so if the problem is severe and it's a problem where some more complex form of communication gives them a relative advantage, that will be favored up to a point. And there's always a trade-off. Every animal would benefit from having language. It's just not worth the investment that into the brains, into the articulatory system, and so on. So it's the problem that defines the need.
Now, a lot of people would say, well, evolution is not continuing, but of course that's absurd, right? Just in general, if you asked a person on the street, they would say there's no evolution amongst humans because we're aware of the evolution, but that's not actually true. We do continue to evolve, but our problems are more frivolous. Does that change the way we think about evolution in terms of our own species?
I think the important thing to remember about evolution is that it's a process, and it's a process that's subject to external factors, which may make it faster or slower. So, for instance, there's a very famous phenomenon in evolutionary biology called neutral selection. So if you have 2 populations of animals, you separate them, you put them on different islands, identical, like completely identical islands, completely identical environment, eventually they will diverge evolutionarily. They will evolve to become different, not because it's an advantage, just because they're separated and sort of random factors cause them to become more and more different. That phenomenon to some extent counteracts what we think of as evolution by natural selection. They're really the same underlying process, but which one comes to dominate depends on what's happening in the environment. It's the same with humans. You can't say evolution is not happening to humans, but what you can say is that the way that we deal with the problems that we have, our cultural transmission of ideas, we don't need natural selection to evolve us an ability to read and write. You just need to go to school, and then you can read and write. So these other factors are taking place much, much, much faster than the evolution by natural selection. So you don't so much see natural selection. You do see it in other factors, other features of our genetic makeup, how tall we are, how certain things to do with our immune system. So this is all still going on. It's just that other processes are perhaps more prominent.
So communication, we communicate by talking, or you say reading and writing. Is it possible that there are other forms of communication? If we ran into a life form somewhere else, might they be focused just on smell or on touch or some other sense that we don't even know at this point?
A sense that we don't even know is a bit of a hard thing to wrap our heads around. I mean, we're pretty confident we know quite a lot about physics. We don't think there are any strange forces out there that we've never discovered that would be relevant to something like this. I mean, there are, but they're
a lot of big
relevant
empty space out there.
Right. But these are things that are relevant at cosmic scales, dark energy and things like that. But in terms of what affects organisms on an ordinary sized planet, we pretty much understand what there is. There's electromagnetic radiation, there are vibrations, and we understand the physics of how these communication signals work. So you can pretty much look at a planet and say, okay, I know, sound will work well here, or sound won't work well here because the atmosphere is too thin. I don't expect any really big surprises there. And in fact, if you look at animals on Earth, they make use of pretty much almost all of the physical phenomena that we know of and that are commonplace for communication. So sound, light, non-sound vibration, smells, as you say, electric fields. There are organisms that use electric field. The one that isn't really used for communication is magnetism. And, there are reasons for that because the Earth's magnetic field is pretty strong, but it's not that we don't know about it. We can imagine an animal that uses magnetism, and we just don't find any on Earth. So no, I mean, I don't think that we're going to be all that surprised by the ways that organisms on other planets will communicate, because that's really constrained by their physical environment.
What about the sort of, telepathy, kind of where does that come in? Even in science fiction, it's always about, I'm going to look at you and I'm zapping you with my thoughts. What sense does that belong to?
Well, the standard way that you'd find a scientist dismissing telepathy is, well, we haven't got a physical explanation for it. Like I said, we understand physics pretty well. We don't see how this could work. But I come at it from a biological perspective, and I think telepathy is not going to happen for a completely different reason. If you look at all the communicative systems of organisms on Earth, all of them, every single one, they all evolved from sensing systems. So first we could sense the chemical environment around us, and then our ancestors evolved ways of transmitting messages through the chemical environment. First, our ancestors could detect light. Then they used light as a signal to communicate with other organisms. You can't have a communication system that evolves if it isn't first from a sensing system. And the reason is there's no point in communicating if no one's listening, right? Let's say I'm telepathic. Let's say I evolve the ability to transmit my thoughts, but there's no one who can receive my thoughts, so it doesn't give me any advantage. Conversely, if I evolve an ability to detect other people's thoughts, but no one else is transmitting their thoughts, it's no advantage. It's just not going to evolve.
Is it likely that we would be able to recognize life on another planet?
I think we would, certainly. I think that's not in doubt, because life is a very strange thing, right? Life has this property of being out of equilibrium with its environment. It doesn't look like a rock. It really doesn't. A rock can be there for 1 million years, and that's fine. That's an equilibrium. Life just doesn't look like that, right? Life takes in energy to maintain itself out of equilibrium with the environment. So whatever form life takes, I think we'd recognize it when we see it. even if, there's some things that are difficult to decide whether we think it's life or not, even on Earth. You ask a person whether viruses are alive or not, and there's a philosophical discussion to be had over that. But I think we'd find it fairly clear once it, hit us in the face.
On Earth, we sort of have attained our large size relative to the rest of the Earth. It's like when dinosaurs were here, the atmosphere was different than it is now. It supported bigger life forms. Do we think that there's a universal principle to the size of life, to the kinds of things that would evolve?
This is a field of active research, and there are theories that may or may not be correct, that there's, for instance, a lower limit on the size of life based on how much information you can put in a tiny package, right? In a tiny cell. You need enough information to reproduce that cell, because otherwise you won't get evolution. And without evolution, you won't get any complex life at all. So there are a lot of theories about how small life can be. Miraculously, these calculations end up with an answer just about, more or less the size of the smallest cell on Earth. How large life can be, I think that's a much harder question, because you can imagine, for instance, a closely integrated network of organisms that are so integrated that you might think of them as a single superorganism that could be extremely large, as a forest, for instance. I think that's a much harder question to answer. The interesting thing is that we seem to be in the middle, right, between the very smallest and sort of planet-sized. Is that typical? Good question. A good question. I would say my working hypothesis would be, yeah, it's probably pretty typical.
When we did a project recently about there was a virus, and they ended up, it was killing this gentleman, and he was a goner. And what they did was, his wife found a phage, which is a very old thing, but one of the things she mentioned is just that the phage was about the size of the virus. It's much smaller. And, I wonder about, life on other planets. Would we be dealing with scale, to find the life, like, could it be so small that it's beyond our ability to detect it?
Yeah. Life has existed on Earth for just under 4 billion years. And for the first 3 billion years, that life was very simple, very, very simple, small, single-celled or small multicellular organisms. Really, life that we recognize, the sort of complex ecosystem that we recognize now, has only been around for just over 500 million years out of the almost 4 billion years. So that means that when we discover planets with life on them, chances are, can't be sure, Earth may have been a very strange planet. The history of life on Earth might have been very unusual. But if other planets went through the same sort of process we went through, chances are life on those planets is going to be very simple. But when we find life on other planets, what we really want to find is complex life, right? We want to find life like us, animals and plants and things crawling around and flying through the air and stuff like that. Those things must be larger. They must be larger because you can't get that kind of complexity into these tiny little phages and bacteria and so on. They're simple by necessity. So I think, yes, that we will have to look with a microscope to find most of the life that we find, but complex life will be visible.
Let's say that 1,000 years from now, you can have anybody you want on the ship, and we think there might be something out there, and we can get there. It isn't a big deal. We can get there. What are the kinds of people and things that we need to bring on the ship when we go someplace? Like, do we need to bring a person who understands language? Do we understand, person who understands symbols? What are the types of people who have to be out there looking?
So, I mean, this is obviously a very toy question, because this is never going to happen. What we have at the moment is similar sort of question about who needs to be involved in this search for life. And there things are easy because it's very dynamic, right? We discover a planet with particular kind of life on it. Don't know how we would really find that there's got trees, and then you get a botanist or something like that. And there are plenty of botanists around you could recruit. On your hypothetical spacecraft, you've only got who you go with. Although maybe the answer is, this is a multi-generational ship, and you just train people as they go along with all the knowledge of Earth to learn these things. I think that what we have seen, what is a really, really important observation, is that the search for extraterrestrial life and the science of astrobiology has been, up until now, the domain of biochemists mostly, right? Because the big questions are, what kind of biochemical processes could support life? How do you get life out of no life? Right? We've got a planet, it's got all kinds of chemicals in various puddles and things like that, and somehow it becomes life. How does that happen? So that's really been in the world of the biochemists and the molecular biologists, and then also paleontologists, people looking at the earliest forms of life on Earth. Sooner or later, we have to consider complex life. I don't know when or whether we're going to discover planets with complex life on them, but when we do, then we need evolutionary biologists. And the reason that we need evolutionary biologists is that complex life doesn't evolve for the sake of complexity. Complex life only evolves because of the complex interactions between organisms, the complex ecosystem. You have one organism chasing after another to try and eat it, and this one's running away and it's eating some sort of plant. The plants are getting light, and they have to worry about parasites. It's these complex food webs and complex interactions that drive complexity in an ecosystem. And it's understanding that will be the most difficult thing, probably, for understanding life on another planet. For that, you need evolutionary biologists.
When we look at things like hieroglyphics, for the longest time, we didn't understand them, right? And then there was one guy who liked puzzles, and, we got the Rosetta Stone, and he understood the language of it, and he figured it out, and then we all understood it, right? Has the field of this science evolved enough to be able to go and be ready for the opportunity? We say science is always evolving, it's always replacing something with a better idea. Are we ready to look for life in other places?
I think we are. I think one thing that we need is a very open mind, and I think we've got that. I think that scientists recognize that whatever we discover is likely to be somewhat weird, right? So the best example is a couple of years ago, there was all this excitement about possible discovery of phosphine gas on Venus. People have now said, well, maybe it's probably not phosphine gas, but whatever, it's not the point. The point is, we detected something strange that shouldn't have been there. We recognized, in answer to your previous question, we recognized this was strange. This appeared out of equilibrium. This is not what you expected to find. And so we started looking for mechanisms by which that might have come about. What possible pathways, what possible metabolisms and biochemistries could, under the conditions that exist on Venus, produce this kind of observation. So I think that's a really good sign. I think it's a sign that we are open-minded and recognizing that the biochemistry won't be just like ours. There will be things that are very, very different, and we need to figure out how that plays out.
Going back to the animals for a minute, right now, I know it's your day job, but what are the most sort of pressing or cutting edge ideas that you and people in your field are looking for right now? Like, what is the next thing you're trying to solve vis-a-vis animal communication?
I think we haven't got a good handle on this question, what are animals saying? We really don't. It's extremely difficult, of course, if you can't ask them, and you can't, because by and large they don't have language, except for Alex the parrot. You could certainly ask him, but that doesn't give you a deep insight into what the others are saying. So we know remarkably little. And what's interesting is that a lot of the animals about which we know very little are also very difficult to study. They're often endangered. We may want to know an awful lot about what certain whales are saying to each other, because that's important for conservation purposes. It's important to know whether there's something that we can know about the health of the population, the interactions of the populations, and also whether we can intervene. We can use sound to, for instance, if we understood how wolf howls were interpreted by wolves, we might be able to use sound to keep wolves away from livestock and so on. So there are a lot of conservation implications there as well, quite apart from the pure science. But these are precisely the animals that are difficult to study. Whales in the middle of the open ocean, wolves at night in the mountains. These are really, really difficult things to do. And I would say these are pressing. I would say that they're pressing needs. They don't rank very highly on the on the priorities of funding organizations, unfortunately.
They don't until they're essential, and then they do.
But what about, I mean, as the technology evolves, so for example, we now have drones, we have things that we can, do, might maybe can help a little bit, right? It's not the same thing, but you could have drones, if you thought you could tag where wolves were, and then you could have drones out there at night. I mean, is the technology at least advancing enough to be able to continue to work on the problem, and then also do people care enough to fund it, I guess, is the...
Yeah, no, the technology has been tremendous, and the technology has really made a huge difference, and to my work particularly. So, for instance, we use acoustic technology that will locate the animals passively. So we triangulate their position from the sound, and then we don't need to catch them and put collars on them, which quite often you can't do, particularly if it's an endangered species. So that gives us a big handle. Drones, as you say, we use drones as well. Cameras, a lot of remote cameras, but all of this technology is money. So we can do things now that we wouldn't have dreamt of 20 years ago. It is a big improvement.
If we were around 4 billion years ago, things out there would be a lot closer to us. It's moving away. Everything appears to be moving away from each other, so that if we came here 5 or 6 billion years from now, we'd just be in the inky black darkness. For humans, it's very hard to follow time and space. Do you think that we are actually in a position where we'll be lucky enough to catch another alien? In my mind, there's undoubtedly a civilization out there. It's just, will we ever be able to recognize it, and will we be able to live at a time where we might be able to have a real conversation, or is it just so random?
Yeah, I think that, well, there's two completely different questions. It's a question about civilizations out there with a language that we can speak to and we can communicate with, and then there's the question of life of other sorts. Will we ever even discover, get to know anything about other life, given that it's very difficult to go to other planets? I think the answer to the second question is a qualified yes. I think that we'll certainly be able to detect life pretty soon, I think. And in terms of finding out more about it, there are what sound like madcap ideas to send probes to nearby planets in a reasonable length of time. So I think as technology advances, that will become possible. I think it's very hard to imagine we will ever go visit these other planets, but who knows?
If given the opportunity and they wanted to put you in one of those lava tubes up on Mars, would you be going or would you be staying?
Well, I don't think Mars is a particularly interesting place to be.
Yeah, especially in a lava tube. Who wants to live in a lava tube,
But if we had clear evidence of complex life on a nearby planet, I think that the temptation to go there and observe that life with your own eyes would be strong.
What did you make of the movie? Was it Arrival, the one where you have the suckers on the glass and it's thinking in time? Did you see that one?
Yeah. I mean, I like science fiction. It is science fiction. I think there's very little of it that informs us deeply about the actual issues there, but that's okay. We don't have to be working all day. Yeah, I mean, humans obviously have this very complex relationship with our concept of extraterrestrial civilizations. We want them. We want to believe that they exist. We're kind of scared of them.
Yeah.
We want them to come and save us, but they might come and eat us. There's this very, very complex relationship there. And none of it, I think, bears much resemblance to reality. So that's okay.
Yeah.
You can explore a lot of those fears. You can explore a lot of human hopes and fears through science fiction without impinging too much on the science.
Yeah. Well, wonderful. Thank you so much for talking to us about this stuff.
Well, thank you.
I'm going to have you on another time and we're going to discuss telepathy, because I'm thinking that, as you've been speaking, that it is a byproduct of sensing. And then
I promise to save you from that.
And you're not even on that one, Jesse. You're not going to be invited on.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Arik, very much. Bye.